Okay. I'm going to start with a quiz, which hopefully will gather everybody's attention. So by show of hands, how many folks believe that the United States Marine Corps is a hierarchical command and control type organization? Just raise your hand if you think that. All right. Okay. So a lot of hands raised. Just to share a little bit about my background, is I served in the Marine Corps for 8 years, some of the best 8 years of my life. And what I learned really quickly is that our military doctrine definitely is based on command and control until you get into an operational environment. And so you've probably heard the analogy many times that, you can have a great plan, but once that first bullet is fired, or that first shot is fired, and you get in that operational environment, the whole plan goes to pot, and then you're basically trying to react and respond and make decisions faster than that operational cycle is driving you to do. And it's very complex, it's exciting, and I had the opportunity to enjoy that on a couple occasions. So to relate that to what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about a study that we sponsored, and the study was basically collecting data and making an assessment of whether hierarchical command and control organizations could survive in today's business environment. And really what we came to put the bottom line up front, what we found out was that there are a number of command and control organizations that can do well in today's operating environment, but there's far more rigor on those organizations to change and adapt because the business cycles are moving a lot faster, and there's a lot of different factors that are propelling business and the economy in ways that companies right now and organizations are trying to struggle and adapt to. So out of this study, what we determined was that really companies have to grow and develop and become a lot more mobile or movement-oriented. And so we coined the phrase of kinetic organization. So what we're going to talk about today is we're just going to quickly talk about okay, what is a traditional command and control hierarchical organization that I'm talking about right now? What are some of those themes or some of those attributes that are with those organizations? And then we're going to talk about what is in the economic environment right now that's propelling change. And companies will look internally and say, how do we adapt to be more successful and to survive in this environment? And we're going to talk about the fundamentals of a kinetic organization. And then lastly, I'll just really briefly cover the fact that we've got a cool assessment tool that's web-based that folks can go online and take a look at and enter in information about their company to see how kinetic you are. And so when we looked at, hey, what's driving this situation where companies that may have a little bit more of a traditional command and control structure are not being incredibly successful with, why are they being forced to adapt? And we narrowed it down to really 5 key areas. And the first thing is the economy and the speed of the economy right now is changing exceptionally fast. And so I remember a little over 10 years ago when I was in B school, and the concept of globalization at the time was not new, but the concept of how fast globalization was changing was relevant. And basically the projections on how fast the economy and China was going to grow and all these things, people were doubting. But at the end of the day, we've all seen the growth over the last 10 years. I can't tell you how many times I've seen presentations today where folks have said, hey, we do these things, but it's all produced elsewhere. So the economy's changing rapidly, and we're having to deal with that and figure out how to operate in a global environment. Business cycles are far faster than they were in the past, and they keep getting faster. It's driven by technology and the fact that we can communicate and gather and analyze data so much faster that we can make decisions faster too if we've got the right types of organizations and the right type of decision-making model to adapt to those. Social changes, we've talked about these today. Some other presenters have talked about this, which is tied to technology. But basically, you have a situation where communities are not local. Communities are, they used to be a town was a community. Then it was, it grew to a region was a community. Well, now the globe is a community. I mean, if I asked you guys how many of you have folks that you're connected to, whether it's via Facebook or on LinkedIn, that are based on the other side of the globe, how many folks would raise their hand then? Almost the entire room. And 10, 15 years ago, that really was something where Far less people would raise their hand if I'd asked that question. So key dynamics, the last thing is with regard to sustainability, corporations and organizations are faced with the question of how do we become the best stewards that we can be of the environment that we live in, right? We don't want to overutilize our planet and our natural resources and not leave a legacy where the human beings that are going to follow us in the future are not going to be able to live and enjoy the same things that we did. So when you look at a traditional organization, there's some key characteristics that come about when you talk about command and control. Typically, it's directional. So you've got this cell of very smart senior people that make the majority of the decisions for the company, and then it transcends throughout that organization in a downward fashion. If you thought about what it would look like in an image, maybe in a triangle, it's got a little bit of depth. And then the spans of control really are within that direction that you've got to follow in that organization. And you don't have a whole lot of opportunity to shift, change direction, or influence the direction that's been passed on to you as the strategy of the company. There's a silo mentality, so you have a situation where a lot of organizations do not function well across those departments. It's not matrixed, it's very straight line, and then you have a lot of times where your talent is developed within one department. So you don't have folks that grow in the company that are exposed to all types of different business functions and different market conditions so they can develop a more universal way of managing the business. And so ultimately the reason that we have determined that this is not the right way to move forward, and we've seen a number of examples where some of our more traditional organizations have not succeeded well. I mean, obviously, if you asked Henry Ford some 70 years ago if the auto industry was going to essentially have to get rescued by the U.S. government, he probably wouldn't have said yes. We're incredibly successful, we invented the product, and we're going to continue to be successful. But they really didn't adapt and change to the market, and they were faced with a situation after the financial crisis in 2007 where they had to make some serious changes. And so organizations that are in that traditional model, sometimes they're more deliberate, they're slower to move, and by virtue of that, they get themselves caught up into a fixed type operating environment where they're not going to be agile enough to deal with today's economic certainty and conditions. I love the phrase that Mark used earlier, which is, hey, globalization, he didn't use globalization, but the bottom line is the train has left the station. I mean, the business that we operate in, all the professionals in this room that look at progressive ways to work, ways to change, adapt, we're moving in the direction that we need to because we know we're already there. We already have to move in that direction. If you're not already moving there, then you're on the tail end of the curve and you really have to catch up. So what does it mean to be a kinetic organization? What are the things that a kinetic organization has to embrace to operate and succeed in today's business environment? And these things are really fundamental. But what we came to understand is that those companies that are succeeding now, the first basic premise that they embrace is that they're incredibly agile. So they're able to change very quickly. They do not lock themselves into courses of action that they can't shift in another direction with a pretty fast time period by which they can make that shift. And so that's the first thing they embrace. Secondly, they know that they have to maneuver in today's business environment, but while they do that, they can't compromise delivering on the highest level of quality. I'm sure all of us that are parts of businesses today recognize the fact that the barriers to entry of a company that's going to compete with us are far shallower or thinner and easier to penetrate than they were in the past. Just by virtue of the information and the ability for an emerging market to be able to produce something better than an existing market far faster, and some of these yields through technology that companies can gain and set something up very fast, the barriers to entry are very small. And so you can get a new competitor that can totally change the game. And when that happens, if you're not able to shift to that, or you don't have a very strong value proposition by level of your quality and how you deliver on your commitments with your clients, well then their cost to change is really low, and they're going to look for different options. Thirdly, they have to be agile, but you can't shift courses and not be able to shift your costs. And so this is a key factor where if you're gonna shift your strategy in a different direction, let's say you decided you were going to penetrate Latin America, and you set up 4 operations in Latin America, and it just didn't pan out after 6 months, and then all your market intel is telling you that Eastern Europe is where your product's going to be viable and your true revenue growth is going to be there. Well, you've got to be able to pick up and either shut down the operations or minimize those in Latin America and move those resources over to Eastern Europe without leaving the costs behind at Latin America so that it continues to be an encumbrance on the business. These companies have variable models where they're able to make these changes. Okay, so while they make these changes, I think this is probably one of the most profound differentiators in these two types of organizations. The reality is, if you heard me talk about the traditional command and control type hierarchical organization, it was one where there was a top-level cell that really drove the direction of the business. Now, leaders in business are always going to drive direction, but the reality is kinetic organizations embrace the fact that innovation comes from all levels in the organization and comes from internal resources as well as external resources. And they also embrace the fact that in order to have that quality that I spoke about earlier, they've got to continually innovate. They've got to continually pursuing new ideas, new innovations in their product, because there is no space or time to slow down. Again, shallower barriers of entry, easier for a competitor to come in and take market share. If you want great examples of how this happens, I mean, look at the mobile market. That's probably one of the most dynamic markets right now in business, and just look at how fast it changes and how fast market share can shift. Being perpetually competitive is that kinetic organizations embrace the fact that they will continually improve. And it's not part of, it's not something that they do annually. It's not something that they do quarterly, but every member of this organization, as they're held accountable and expected to innovate and drive new ideas in their organization that's going to help that company grow and thrive, they're also expected to assess themselves, assess their own infrastructure, assess their capabilities, pursue knowledge, and grow as an organization to keep continually improving in the market space in order to succeed. And then lastly, different treatments, and this is a unique way to describe this, but the bottom line is common rules apply in command and control organizations. One of the strengths of a command and control organization is typically you're going to have a very strong process, and it's simple, and it can be replicated very fast. That can be a strength, but the reality is, I think we've heard diversity a number of times today, and when we talk about innovation, and we talk about continual improvement, and we talk about leveraging all your resources to grow and run a successful company or a successful organization, you've got to be able to treat individuals and organizations a bit differently. And the same rule does not apply. If you do frame it up, then you're going to lose some of those other factors like innovation and some of that energy that a company can drive by empowering people to help drive the company. All right. So, no, this is not going to be a quiz on molecular structure or the periodic table. But what you see here is a sampling of an operational cell within a kinetic organization. And what you really see is that you've got multiple players or influencers in the process. It's a tight-knit cell. To draw this into a market example, this would be like an operating unit in any market. You know, a citywide market, it could be smaller than that. But essentially, what this diagram shows is that you've got the key components all interconnected. They're matrixed. Everybody's ideas and beliefs and values and energy influence where that cell goes locally. And then you've got some leadership that's overlaid on top of that where they're involved in the process of making sure that they succeed and have the right direction and they're working well together, but they're not stifling it. It's not a direct line. It's not a single channel or a single silo, and it's multifunctional. And then if you scale that up to how it works within a company, you've got these different business units spread throughout a region or a market, and you've essentially got a central governing body. And this is how companies, and especially if you look at where we are today, more and more companies that operate here in Northern California are more progressive. They certainly have more of a decentralized structure, but they've got a governor in there that's going to ensure that they don't lose the culture of the company. And that's really where that governor sits, is it's a central coordinating body, not a command body, but a coordinating body to make sure that all those elements are taking advantage of their knowledge and their drive and innovation in each market, but also we're on a common path to make sure that the company succeeds. Okay, so now to tie it into Workspace, and I think where our focus is, and where WORKTECH focuses as well, is that obviously real estate being one of the top 3 costs that almost any company faces plays a huge role in how flexible a company can be and how their resources will not, how they can manage the flexibility within their resources. So basically, this diagram that you see right here, what this is showing you is this. Look, kinetic organizations are embracing a different way to work. I mean, the presentation by Mark and Dan was exceptional. We've seen some others that really talk about distributed work, but it is the way of the future. I mean, not to be too cliche, but the train has left the station for most companies. I'll add that one caveat in there. But kinetic companies, for sure, the train has left the station. And they recognize that they've got more knowledge workers, and these folks don't have to be tied to a workstation. And so what these companies are doing is they're really optimizing or rationalizing their fixed real estate infrastructure. And then they're leveraging all the other real estate that's out in the market. And I think we've heard the examples of what's out there today. You've heard third spaces. I've seen the Marriott brand. I've talked to folks on little coffee sidebar conversations about these different third spaces that you can tap into. And then there's a huge universe of flexible workspace, which Regus is a part of, but there's a lot more there, and that's growing expansively. I had a colleague ask me today, how many flexible workspaces are there out there? Not just in your network, but are there out there, and how fast is it going to grow? How many are there going to be in 2015 or 2016? And I said a lot. Things growing. It's really growing, and it's not growing because it's a cool concept. It's growing because more people can work where they're at, but they still need a professional space to work sometimes. So they can't just work at a third space like a Panera Bread or Starbucks. They can for some functions, but there's a lot of work functions, whether it's collaboration or sticking with people, they can't do that. So just to touch on a couple other things, this is a graph that shows how companies need to change. They've got a fixed real estate model with a variable. You see that sign? It's kind of like the heartbeat monitor that Dan showed earlier. But the bottom line is that this is how companies' portfolios look today. And if they leverage third space and flexible space, they can reduce all those costs and adapt to the variability and cut a tremendous amount of fixed costs out of their portfolio and become far more flexible to shift their resources. I'm going to skip this example because I'm low on time, but the thing that I will point out here is when you talk about tangible costs, and Philip, I don't know if you're still tweeting, but there's a hard cost to complexity. Put that out there real quick. And what that means is this. Look, when you look at flexible space compared to fixed space, what you see is that you've got all these capital investments in fixed space. There's tremendous complexity in lease negotiations, planning, and everything else. Well, if you don't have to do it, why do it? In flexible workspace, all of that's included, and there's some tremendous cost gains, as well as flexibility gains when you tap into it. The last thing I'll touch on here, and I'm almost done, is that obviously when people think about reducing their fixed real estate, they think about, oh, I'm going to lose that collaborative space. Can't lose that. And it's true, you can't. Especially in a kinetic organization, collaboration is absolutely key. But the reality is, if you heard me earlier about flexible space, there is an amazing amount of flexible space in the market today that every company can take advantage of, and they don't have to have it as a monthly lease cost. All right, so this is the website. You guys can come visit any of the folks with Regus. There's a cool website where you can literally just answer a quick survey, and it'll assess how your company fits within that kinetic organization. And I think what companies, when they've completed this, what they've found useful about it is that it gives them a good rudder check on where they are in the process and enables some really good conversations if they need to make some organizational change. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Josh. That's great.